I'm Charles Epting from Siegel Auctions, and I'm standing here in Washington, D.C. in front of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. I took the train down from New York this morning because I have a very exciting day in store. I'm going to be spending it with Dan Piazza. He's the Chief Curator of Philately here at the NPM. He's a good friend, and he and I have discussed this idea for a while now. He's done a ton of research on the famed inverted Jenny, and he's put together a walking tour of all of the sites, all of the landmarks associated with this incredible stamp. So I'm going to go meet up with Dan now, and he and I are going to take you on this adventure through Washington, D.C. as we retrace that fateful day in May of 1918 when the inverted Jenny was welcomed into philately. Dan, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I am very excited about this, but for people who maybe don't know who you are, can you give a quick little background on your personal history with the NPM and your involvement in philately in general?
Sure. I'm Dan Piazza. I'm curator of the stamp collection here at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and I've been here for 16 years. We tell the story of the inverted Jenny a lot here at the museum. We feature it in the philatelic galleries upstairs.
It really is an icon of American philately. This
is.
This is the poster child of our hobby.
It is. It's nationally famous. It's internationally famous. It's also a very local story. I started researching the history of these sites and kind of mapping them out. This is a tour. This inverted Jenny walking tour is a tour that I've only given to a handful of, philatelic friends and visitors to the museum. So, I'm excited to give you the tour, but then also for people to be able to come along with us online and see the Jenny sites in Washington, D.C.
We are standing on New York Avenue in front of a building that unfortunately was not here in 1918. But can you talk a little bit about where we're standing and why this is maybe the most important site in relationship to the inverted Jenny?
So we're standing on the site, or at least in the block, in the city block, where the post office, where William Roby bought the sheet of inverts, was located in 1918. It was known at the time as the New York Avenue Post Office. This is the street, and along this sidewalk here where Roby was on the prowl in search of inverted Jennies.
So on the morning of May 14th, he left his house, he came here, or he went to his office, I assume.
I think he went to work first, that's right, which is
here,
right around the corner.
We're going to go there in a second.
Yep.
He came here, he rifled through sheets of the 24-cent Jenny stamp.
Right.
He didn't see any to his liking. He claimed he was looking for well-centered examples, but we know in retrospect he was looking for the invert.
Right.
So he left, came back around lunchtime, and walked in with at least $24 in his pocket, and walked out with the most famous postage stamp in American history.
Right.
Right on this site.
Right.
Incredible. What do you say we go to Roby's office? We can recreate the walk he would have made with that sheet
Right.
stamp.
Yeah,
on that
let's
day.
do it.
Let's go do it right now.
Right around the corner.
So Dan, we're here right around the corner from New York Avenue. We're on 15th Street. What building are we standing in front of right now?
Yeah, well, what it'd take us about 30 seconds to get here
quick little walk.
from the New York Avenue Post Office, and this is where William Roby worked. He was a clerk at Hibs Bank here in Washington, D.C.
So this is where he presumably left from to go get the stamp, and this is where he came immediately after making his infamous purchase.
Right, right.
And he wasn't the only one to come here that day. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in the hours after he made his purchase?
Well, Roby hurries back here with the sheet of inverted Jennies from the post office, and within the space of a few hours, the word is out, at least among the collector community in Washington, D.C., that he's found something really great, because several collectors, several prominent Washington, D.C. stamp collectors turn up at the bank asking to see the stamps. And then more ominously, the postal inspectors, this is the first place they show up, trying to hound Roby into selling them back the sheet of stamps.
So they realized that something had gone wrong at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. They knew these stamps had gotten out. They were trying to save face. They didn't want this to be an embarrassment and reflect poorly on the new airmail service. So even though they didn't really have a legal leg to stand on, they thought they could maybe shake him down, intimidate him into turning these stamps over so that word wouldn't get out.
There had already been a lot of controversy over the new airmail service. Hearings in Congress, people not sure why the Post Office Department was spending so much money on this fad of carrying mail by planes, and it seemed to some watchdogs in Congress, it seemed like an extravagant expense. There had been hearings in Congress, and so the discovery of this error stamp with the plane flying upside down and I guess making everything sort of look like a bungled operation was they were afraid that was just one more bit of bad publicity that the airmail service didn't need.
So you also told me earlier that Roby tried to keep the stamps in the vault at this bank. He tried to leave them here, and the bank manager said, "No way! I don't want the inspectors coming and try." So this building really is critical to the entire story. This is, if the post office is ground zero, this is not far behind in terms of fateful landmarks on that, May 1918 day. Our next stop, I think, should be HQ. It should be the Post Office Tower, where sort of the official government response to this scandal was orchestrated from. Why don't we head that way now?
Okay, that's this way.
Perfect. Awesome. So we're here on the steps of the old post office. It is now a Waldorf Astoria hotel. But this building was built 1897. And what was it constructed as? What did this serve as in the late 19th century when it was built?
So originally this building was built as a combination Washington D.C. main city post office and post office department headquarters. Then in 1914, the building that's now the National Postal Museum opened. That became the city post office, but this was still post office department headquarters into the 1930s.
So who would have been in this building on the morning of May 14th, 1918?
So a few people would have been headquartered here when the inverted jennies were discovered. Most important for our purposes probably is Colonel Benjamin Lipsner, who was an Army Air Corps guy who had been detailed to the post office department to help them get the new airmail service going. It's here that he's alerted that the inverted jennies have been found and has a conniption because
his back's already against the wall. He needs to make sure that this rollout is as successful as possible. And he, like you said earlier, the plane's upside down. It's the worst sort of visual blunder that you could possibly imagine for a controversial program that he's been tasked to oversee. So once the invert is discovered at the post office here in town, what was the next step that the post office undertook?
So two things emanate from this building that day. One is the postal inspectors are headquartered here, and they're sent out to chase Roby down and hound him to get the stamps back. But also the airmail stamps are being sold in a handful of post offices, not just here in Washington, D.C., but in Philadelphia and New York, which were all the cities to be connected by the airmail. So telegrams go out immediately to all of the post offices that have the stamps in stock, and they're told to stop selling them, to shut down their windows that are selling them, and check their inventory of stamps that have been shipped to them and make sure there are no other inverts.
And that all happened in this very building?
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So we've traced Roby's day so far. Where did Roby end up once he realizes what he has, once he gets the postal inspectors off his tail? What's one of his other stops that day? I think there was a stamp dealer nearby.
When he finally leaves work, he's afraid to go home because he's heard from his wife that the postal inspectors have visited her there. And so, according to his own account, he spends the rest of the afternoon into the early evening just riding the streetcars in Washington, D.C.
With the stamps?
With the stamps. And then that evening, he visits the stamp shop of Hamilton Coleman, which is a few blocks from here on 7th Street. We can go see that next.
Let's go head over there. Dan,
cheers.
Cheers. Where are we right now?
So we're sitting in the District Chop House Brewery and Restaurant in Washington, D.C. But back in 1918, where we're sitting on the ground floor, this was a bank, but upstairs there were office suites, and one of those offices was the premises of Hamilton Coleman, who was one of the best-known stamp dealers in Washington, D.C. at the time. So Roby came here because he knew Coleman, as evidenced by the fact that the first dealer he calls and advises of the fact that he's bought the sheet of inverted jennies is Hamilton Coleman.
And Roby is spooked by the postal inspectors. He wants to get rid of this thing as quickly as possible. He's not looking to hang on to the inverted jennies for very long.
Right. So he's looking to sell the stamps fairly quickly, both because he's being dogged by the postal inspectors, but also because there's the possibility that more sheets are going to show up, and that's going to devalue his purchase.
So this is interesting because a lot of stamps produced at this time were produced in 4 panes of 100, and then the stamps would have been split into their respective panes of 100 that you'd get at the post office.
Right.
there was some speculation that if there was one sheet of inverted jennies, one pane of inverted jennies, there had to be 3 others, 300 more stamps.
Right.
So this sort of sent shockwaves through the DC philatelic scene. People, A, started looking for more of them, but did it also sort of scare Roby that what he thought was this incredible historic discovery might be devalued if hundreds of more of these stamps hit the market?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of that speculation that there are at least 3 more sheets floating around out there starts in this building. So Roby calls presumably the first dealer that came to mind who he knew, Coleman. And when he calls, it's Coleman's employee, Catherine Manning, who answers the phone. And Manning had been Coleman's employee for a long time. She had worked for J. Murray Bartels before him when he was a dealer here in Washington, D.C. And she also knew Joseph Levy, who was the first curator of philately at the Smithsonian. So when Roby brings the sheet here to show Coleman that evening, all of the philatelic worthies of Washington, D.C.
Sort of a who's who.
They're all assembled here to see the sheet, right? And so Miss Catherine Manning is there, and Joseph Levy is there. And Levy seems to be the one who sets off the biggest philatelic goose chase in history, because he sees the sheet of stamps and tells Roby that, look, as you were saying earlier, the full press sheet should be 400. If there's one pane, there should be 3 others out there. He doesn't yet understand, no one yet understands, that the stamps have been printed on the flat plate printing press rather than on the big Stickney rotary presses that are already in use in 1918.
What I think is interesting, what was Coleman's offer to purchase the sheet?
Coleman offered Roby $500
versus
for the
the
full sheet.
$15,000 that he would get just a couple of days later.
Yeah.
So this was obviously a lowball offer.
Well, to my knowledge anyway, he was not the sort of dealer who had really wealthy clients like a Worthington or a Colonel Green, he was sort of more your average stamp shop dealer at the time. And I think he understood that he wasn't going to get the sheet for $500, but he figured he had to make an offer.
Sure.
So this is again one of the few locations
where
the intact sheet, we know it was under this roof, right? And as I mentioned to you, I think earlier, maybe 1 or 2 dozen people saw the full intact sheet, and most of them were here that night. They were the people who gathered here in Coleman's office to see the sheet, which was already, by that evening, kind of legendary.
And lastly, you came here a number of years ago. What are we drinking right now? Explain your own personal history in this place.
So a number of years ago, when I was first researching all the sites connected to the Jenny in Washington, D.C. and so forth, and I came here and again with a group of collectors, and I was telling them this story of what had gone on in the building, and someone who worked for the restaurant overheard, and somehow it got back to the management what we were talking about. And anyway, that inspired them to create something that they called the Inverted Jenny Imperial IPA beer that they served here at the District Chop House. So we're here having the Imperial IPA
in honor of
in
that
honor
fateful
of
night
Inverted Jenny,
when they got to see the sheet intact,
right.
Not long before it was all split up.
Right.
So again,
Right.
Cheers to that.
Yes.
And then we're going to continue our tour after this.
Yes. So this is one of the more obscure sites connected with the Jenny
We are
story.
out of the city now, basically. We're out of downtown, at least. I feel like we're in a much more suburban neighborhood. Explain what 1420 Harvard Street is.
So we're in the neighborhood of Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C. And this is where William Roby lived in 1918, here at 1420 Harvard Street. And so finally, after riding the streetcars all day, after the meeting at Coleman's office, finally Roby wrote in one of his accounts, I think, that he finally thought it was safe to come back here at about 10 o'clock at night. He came back with the sheet of stamps. And in one of his accounts, he writes about actually sleeping with the stamps under his mattress here in his apartment that night. So he's really you could see why the pressure to offload these stamps really quickly. He's sort of scared at having them, doesn't know what to do with them, is afraid that more of them might show up, and I imagine he had a very sleepless night here in his apartment,
knowing that they were underneath his mattress.
Right.
But this isn't the end of the story for Roby. He's able to sell the sheet for $15,000, which is $14,976 profit.
Right.
And what does he do with that money?
Well, $15,000 is an incredible amount of money in 1918. It was a life-changing amount of money. So he wanted a car, and his wife Caroline wanted a house. He bought both of those. And as late as 1940, when his daughter, he had two daughters, maybe it's the same daughter that was being pushed around in the pram to avoid the postal inspectors. I can't remember now. But when his daughter got married in 1940, even then he said that the proceeds from the inverted Jenny were paying for the wedding. So it was a life-changing amount of money.
And he stuck around the neighborhood. We're going to go walk to that house that he bought, which is not too far from where we are on Harvard Street right now.
The house that Jenny bought.
The house that Jenny bought. Let's go see it.
All right.
So we're just about a 10-minute walk away from that apartment on a much different street. This is a beautiful residential street. We're at 1709 Kenyon Street, which is the house where the proceeds of the inverted Jenny went.
This is the house that William Roby bought with the proceeds from the sale of the inverted Jenny. So we're now in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Back in 1918, 1919, when Roby bought and moved into this house, this was a fairly new neighborhood. It was one of the new kind of residential streetcar suburbs that a lot of sort of wealthier middle class people were moving into, people who worked downtown in Washington, D.C. And so they bought this single family home in Mount Pleasant.
Incredible. And today we've traced the footsteps from the post office counter where he purchased it, to the bank where he took it, to the stamp dealer where he took it. And this is the end product of all of it. This is sort of the natural conclusion to a tour on the inverted Jenny. I think it's just amazing. This has just been the most wonderful day following in the footsteps. It's one thing to hold...
Flight path. The flight path.
The flight path of the Jenny.
Right.
Well, yeah, except